everything is uncertain. And the poorer you are, the more you're vulnerable. We've had a regime of human rights. All this should have improved. Why are we seeing that more and more ways in which these problems exist are beginning to manifest?
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights in Business, also known as IHRB. I am Deborah Sago, and in this podcast, you'll hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. You've just heard from Usha Ramanathan. Usha is a human rights scholar who focuses on the intersection between poverty with business and human rights. What are the key issues in these areas in 2024? You'll hear Usha's thoughts on this shortly. But first, let's hear from my colleague Salil Tripathi, who spoke to Usha. Salil, every year IHRB presents its top 10 business and human rights issues. 2024's edition looks at the places where the actions of business are likely to have a critical impact on human rights in the years to come. Can you give, a description of what the top 10 is?
Yeah, so from the beginning, when the Institute began, every year we look at the top 10 issues that matter for business and human rights over the next year. Sometimes we focused on a specific issue like gender. Sometimes we've looked at only climate. Sometimes we looked at migrant workers as a broad overarching theme. But the point is to show that business applies and has an impact in many areas of life. Top 10 is a nice way to capture the issues that matter. It doesn't mean that there are only 10 issues that are important. There are many more. But if we focus on the 10 key issues, it's one way for business, society, workers, consumers, states, and other actors to focus on what's going to matter. It's not that if an issue has been mentioned in year 1, 2, and 3, it no longer matters later, or that it has been fixed and solved. Because human rights is like a wheel. You have to keep going at it and, keep going at it and keep making progress, and the horizon keeps shifting away from you.
Why did you want to speak to Usha particularly about this?
I think there are several reasons to speak to Usha. One is that she's an extremely important voice, not only from the global south, but from a global human rights perspective, because she looks at human rights in a holistic way. She has worked on some of the most important issues that have affected business and human rights, whether it is surveillance, whether it is technology, poverty, industrial pollution. She has done outstanding work, in trying to make sure that when governments install systems which are intended to help people, they are actually benefiting the people rather than the government. She has looked at that, and she has also looked at the role of non-state actors. And she has touched many aspects of human rights, both India and beyond. And she has been a great friend of the Institute. She has taken part in many of our activities in other parts of the world, including conflict in Colombia, land in Africa, and so on. So we thought it was a good time, given that 2023 was the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, to speak to someone like her.
Let's talk more generally about the top 10. Can you take us through some of the issues we'll be highlighting in this episode?
If you look at the top 10 by themselves, we had Eleanor Roosevelt's speech on the 10th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, where she said that human rights matter not only in the public space, but also in the offices, homes, farms, and factories. So they have an impact everywhere. And we wanted to look at that holistic aspect. That was a past. From the present perspective, we wanted to look at what is happening to the people as it happens, whether they are indigenous communities, whether they're migrant workers, whether they're working on the sea. And we wanted to be a bit more experimental and playful and look at future and look at things such as space and oceans, where human rights, of course, matter, but not sufficient attention has been paid to that.
Thanks, Salil. Let's hear from Usha now to get her reflections.
So, Usha, my first question is that we've just had the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and there were lots of reflections around it. We had an event in which you spoke as well. On balance, was it a good thing, a bad thing? Is it a glass half full, half empty? Have we a lot to be proud about? Have we a long path ahead? How do you see the situation?
I think the past 2 to 3 decades has actually told us how important human rights really are. Soon after the Second World War, when we spoke about the human rights, when human rights were being spoken about as also, as mediating the relationship between states and the people, and certain recognitions that the state needed to have, for it to be a legitimate state. We went through that phase, and then in about the 70s and 80s, we were learning how to think about people, about situations, about things, and learning to think beyond power. In the past 2 decades, 2.5 decades especially, we've seen there is a slide in this. States seem to have acquainted themselves much too much with human rights and have learned how to push the limits as far as they can go. We've seen that, talk about terrorism, for instance. Terror has been one of the ways in which the whole idea, the edifice of human rights is sought to be brought down. Just the idea of national security has proved to be sufficient for states to say that rights have to be eroded. So if we did not have these rights which were set out with the clarity with which they've been set out, it might have been really difficult to find a language in which to contest the kind of power states are taking unto themselves.
Yeah.
So I think it's, if we ask, is human rights, is the human rights regime providing for people what it should? I think it's providing an extremely important role of producing the friction that is needed for states not to just take all the power unto themselves.
So let's build on that and talk about business here, because business also has a lot of power and it often wants to avoid the responsibility. What have we learned and where do we need to go on that?
I think the kind of scale that we see is a similar kind of scale with business, because business interest and state interest, unfortunately, over a period of time, as it perhaps has always been, but in my lifetime, I'm seeing it happen all over again. So I have to say it, that business interest and state interest seem to begin to collaborate. And there are partnerships that get created between them. And while one is about political power, the other is about economic power, and that leaves people extremely vulnerable. We know that we've had multiple debates, especially in the past 20, 25 years, on business and human rights. And we know that among the debates, and I must say that, my part in the debate has been to say that we will not ask for businesses to be providing human rights to people, but in respecting human rights and not taking shelter behind the state. I think the notion of complicity of corporations has been one of the very important things that has been produced in this discourse, where corporations cannot hide behind states and say that it's the state that is providing all that needs to be provided and the corporation has nothing to do with it. They're just running their business. I think that veil has been cast off. And it's an important thing that has happened. But we also know that because of the relationship between the state and business interest, and in that, I just want to put it in parentheses there that I think the idea of the GDP without acknowledging inequality has been one of the damaging things that's happened in the past years, where states want to be in the forefront of, being a power in the world, but are not able to take people along because the two simply don't match.
Yeah.
And we're seeing this happen. And what business has been therefore able to do is to get for itself what it wants from the state. It's not just land. I mean, it's land, it's resources of various kinds. It's the decimation of workers' rights. It's reducing them to a nullity so that workers are just there to do what they, when they are needed, and then they oughtn't to be seen. I mean, they certainly oughtn't to be heard. So this is something that we've seen happen over a period of time for which business is centrally responsible. Of course, we also know that in the functioning of businesses, we can never forget something like the Bhopal gas disaster. And we haven't seen an assumption of responsibility even in such extreme cases.
This is, of course, the disaster in 1984 when the Union Carbide plant of methyl isocyanate in India exploded, and immediately between 2,000 and 3,000 people died, and over its lifetime, between 10 and 20,000 people have died, and many more lives have been affected. And you played a prominent role in seeking accountability then.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but I think I'm among those who did what we could.
You kept the fire burning. That's important.
It is important not to take, excessive credit for what happened. No, and I think that's important because I think every person who can contribute to the development of this field, every little thing does count. And it's having seen myself in that role, I know that it doesn't matter. You don't have to conquer the world to be able to do this. I think every person, that consciousness of what that disaster meant, and the fact that it never really goes away once it's happened, that has been a very important learning for many of us. And I think many of us who contributed to that, to what was happening in Bhopal, it's about caring about everybody's rights. It's not only what we get, right?
Now, one thing, we who are familiar with your work have known over the years is that you worked always for those without power, without access to their rights, who are fighting to protect and preserve their rights. And the poor are often part of that. And you thought long and hard and deliberated on these issues about poverty. And poverty has a very clear link with those with power and those who are seeking to exercise their rights. And of course, that means the role for both the state and the corporations. I would love you to elaborate a little bit on that, about the interplay between poverty and human rights.
We started off in the context in which I work, we started off with the poor and poverty as poverty. And then we realized that poverty makes it sound like it's a static concept. And it is not static. There is impoverishment, and I think the social sciences for the longest time have seen it as immiseration, for instance. But impoverishment in our context was where policies and laws resonant in increasing poverty and putting more people into poverty. The classic example, the classic illustration for us was when you have mass displacement because of development projects. And that never got accounted for. The people's movements made it impossible not to confront it. So it was like, you pay compensation to a few people who may have some, illegal rights that they can produce to the land. And the rest of it can just be taken over and put to APUs. So the idea of uncertainty, and we actually find that this notion of uncertainty, will I have a job tomorrow, won't I? Will I be able to walk out tomorrow and get myself some food, or won't I? Will I be able to reach my family when I need to, or won't I? Everything is uncertain. And the poorer you are, the less economically self-sustaining you are, the more you're vulnerable to this. So we've seen that, we've had a regime of human rights. All this should have improved. Why are we seeing that more and more ways in which these problems exist are beginning to manifest?
Yeah. So now, we publish these top 10 issues for business and human rights every year, where we look at the business impacts on human rights, both adverse and where they can do get things right. And this year we had looked at it in two ways: the farm, factory, and office, which was a term that Eleanor Roosevelt used in the 1948 Declaration, the speech after that in 1958 at the 10th anniversary. She spoke about that, and we wanted to see how that plays out. And poverty features in at least four of the themes: farms and trees and migrant workers and so on. So could you elaborate on how the commercialization of farm, the way it is going, what are the risks for the poor and the vulnerable? What are the responsibilities of business in that regard?
See, the first thing I think, of course, when we talk about farming and agriculture, especially, is that we just can't leave climate change out of this conversation at all. It's affecting the farming community in ways, which are, I won't say unprecedented, because maybe if we look into history, we will find something there, but certainly not in living memory. The way in which we've always had droughts, we've had famines, but it's not just about a drought in a particular year, or it's not just about, too much rainfall, which is destroying crops. It's about the continuing impact that has on the lives of farmers. Now, the problem is when this kind of problem for the farmer is treated as an opportunity to corporatize, which basically means that the one thing that a farmer has, which retains a sense of autonomy, which retains, non-reliance on something else, which itself, as we can see, is uncertain now. The problem is that element, which is land, control over that land is becoming a huge thing now. So it is control over land as land. It's also control over land because they want control over resources. And any production that happens, it's believed it should be, the whole thing should just be business and market. And if we look at the way policies have been made all along, agriculture is seen as separate from industry. And it is industry and business that believes that it has the answers. And, the whole context of privatization, for instance, that states can't do it, people can't do it, private industry has to come and do it. And one of the very interesting things in this, and I use interesting in a very loose way, is how in this whole period that we've tried privatization, it actually hasn't delivered. If privatization had been able to deliver anything at all, we shouldn't be having the kind of, inequality that we have now. We shouldn't be having the kind of malnutrition that we have now. If privatization works, why is it that distribution is not sufficient? People are not able to find the kind of jobs that they need to be able to sustain themselves. And in a country like India, we've also said that don't pay all your profits as taxes. You please put that into a fund, which will be like a corporate social responsibility fund. And you, that is the corporate, will have to deal with education, with health, and with all the rest. Now, plainly, this is not a model that works. And one of the very disturbing things about this period, and I cannot not talk about technology in this, is that what business interest sees as the possibilities of technology are now being inflicted on people. And we know by now, in the context here, we know from the UID project, which was about giving everyone unique identification.
Unique identification.
Yeah, and we know from the way AI is now being spread, we know from the datafication of people that the idea of all of this becoming a commodity and entering the economy and being able to increase the GDP, this has become the priority. And people are losing out because they are losing control over their own lives. It's now being done remotely by people who are looking at some data. This is the datafication of people. This is something that the farmers have begun to see, because with the farmers here, for instance, they say every patch of land has to be on a database. Every patch of it has to have a unique number, which will be attached to the unique number of the farmer. And everything will be remotely controlled and managed. And the corporations will come in. So you have, a number of them like Microsoft and the others coming in, and including our own Adani here, who will come in, and then they will, they will say what needs to be done. They will say where the markets are. They will say what needs to be grown. So it's the thing is that all this has shown us, because technology is new, the generations are going too fast in technology, and people don't really know what tomorrow may bring. The laboratory for all of these experiments is the whole population.
Mm.
So in the context of the agriculture sector, all farmers are becoming the laboratory specimens.
Yeah.
And obviously, to me, that tells me that there is a way in which dispensability and redundancy is being thought about. We used to talk about if an industry doesn't require so many workers, then workers are redundant. Now we are seeing whole populations being capable of being rendered redundant. If they are not, so this is the one use you have of being an experimental guinea pig. And there is no liability attached to this. I think we need to remember that technology is coming. All technology controllers and creators everywhere are asking that there should be absolutely no rules, no liability, that they should be allowed to innovate, and rules should be made around the innovation once it has been made. So who pays the price for all of this?
Yeah.
Here, for instance, we have cybersecurity as a huge issue, but yet we have the datafication of everybody. The farmers' data is all being aggregated and being used and being shared and being transferred, and they have no clue what's happening with it and how they are being viewed.
So technology is a very good segue for the next question I have, which is about cities, because this emphasis on, because that's another thing that emerged in our top 10 this last year. And in that, what we came up with was the thought that smart cities and the focus on clean cities and green cities, and again, managing data for efficient transport and allocation of civic services and all that. Clearly, this will have issues about discrimination and access, not just for the poor, but for the disabled and the marginalized, those who are not literate with technology, those who may have issues such as, not being able to decipher colors and certain languages and all kinds of barriers. So what are the threats you see in that, and what are the responsibilities again for business?
In the context of cities, one of the very important roles that the human rights understanding had to play was in allowing everyone the right to various things that cities provide, which means that I have a right to enter a city. I should have a right to be able to stay there. I should be able to find my work, find maybe creative spaces. If one can, everyone should be able to do it. But what we've actually seen is that we have slums everywhere. We have squatter settlements everywhere. The way people are being kept in their place, in a sense, and to be evicted whenever someone needs to evict them for their purposes, is by producing this idea of illegality. Now, the important thing about human rights has been that it has provided the counter of legitimacy, which counters this idea of illegality. See, laws are something made by people sitting in parliament, and they have certain priorities. And if those priorities are the same as that of the people who need the support of the law, then it would be fine. But we've seen that across the world, I think this is true. Urban spaces, rural spaces, spaces where you want development to happen, all these spaces, the idea of eminent domain has exploded to allow states to exercise control over all these spaces. And illegality is the trope through which people are kept in a state of uncertainty from where they might get evicted whenever it's necessary. So this has been our first thing. And I think we really need to interrogate this idea of legality. I think Gandhi was one of those early ones to question this idea that when the state makes law, there is something automatically legitimate about it because the state has made the law. We need to learn how to interrogate even the idea of law and legality itself. Otherwise, human rights can really fall by the wayside if we don't do this question. Yeah. And now, with the possibilities that technology seems to bring, which is what they call the smart city idea, for instance, that everything is going to be connected up. Corporates are there who will then, monitor and set every one of these systems in place. And so you'll have all these people who can fit into the system are the people who are going to be seen as safe and with a right to the space. People who don't conform to the kind of identity that is required belong in a smart city will find themselves cast out. So it's a model that has been made for corporations to be able to datafy people, but also to give their interest a priority. So, for instance, to say that I should know as a car automaker, how many cars can I manufacture for this area? What is the traffic that keeps moving to and fro? What kind of cars do they seem to like? Where do they buy? If I have all that information, my business can grow. But the idea of surveillance, that you're actually looking at everyone, watching people all the time, you know when they come, when they go, who they meet, that doesn't seem to, bother business interest at all. So I think one of the major things that's happened in the idea of the smart city, for instance, is this idea of surveillance, normalizing surveillance, which is both state surveillance and corporate surveillance. So it's kind of inverted all the human rights movements and campaigns that there were for making a state transparent and for making corporations answerable. Now it's made people transparent and made people have to bear the brunt of right or wrong decisions that are made by someone somewhere else. So I think we're passing through a pretty dangerous phase, and the sooner we acknowledge it, the better. I don't think corporate interests and state interests should be allowed to dominate the interests of vast masses of people. And we need to work at that from within the human rights terrain.
Yeah. And my final question, you use the word space, and I want to take it to the next leap and go beyond the frontier in a sense and talk about the space itself, outer space, because that's like the global commons, right? It belongs to everybody and nobody at the same time. And yet there are private satellites there, private weapon systems being developed there, and there are both good and bad things happening. For example, satellites in the outer space are able to allow, for example, countries where internet has been blocked for people to access, even for legitimate, forget about freedom of expression alone, but even to get basic information on healthcare, they may be able to do so. So that's the positive side of it. But there is the other side of it, which is, of course, the surveillance that goes with it and jamming of. So, I mean, it takes us into a fascinating arena, which in a way the UDHR had never anticipated. And yet at the same time, I'm optimistic enough to feel that if we look at the language clearly and carefully, we might be able to find answers about addressing tomorrow's questions with the tools we had in the past. Is that too optimistic? I mean, do you think we have ways to understand space?
I think I'm going to allow your optimism to sweep over me too, because I like optimism, but I can't say that I share the optimism that you have. See, the thing is, we've already seen, actually the idea of space as a global commons has gone a long time. If it is the global commons, then it is of the kind where, finders keepers, and then, we just go there and we take what we want. We take no responsibility for all the stuff that we leave behind. There might be debris, we might be creating, threats and risks for other people. We don't need to take responsibility for that. But I think there are two things that really, one is that, if we have to conquer space to be able to communicate with each other on the ground, I think just philosophically, I think we need to spend a little time thinking what that means. See, one of the things that hasn't happened at all, and some of us here are trying to work on this, it's that, this whole idea of technology, the current idea of technology has grown without any philosophy. Or if there is a philosophy, it is a very pragmatic philosophy of produce something that will help people who are doing things to continue doing what they want to do. So if they want to get data, if they want to control data, if they want to share data, if they want to take over space, if they want inequality, then there are explanations that are produced. For instance, that people are corrupt, that there is terrorism, that people do money laundering, and whatever else. It's not corporations which need to be held answerable for this, which we need to monitor. It's not the state that we need to monitor in relation to corruption, but it's the people. So, this inversion that's happened is also, this is one kind of thing. But, when you think about the space, therefore, when you think about space, in space, it kind of blew me when I heard that Elon Musk could make a decision about who in a war would have access to the Starlink and who would not. His judgment, he may be a good man. He may be among the best men in the universe. I don't know. But to give anybody that kind of power, because they've been able to reach space and set a satellite there, through which they can then control the war situation, I think that is really something that we need to spend a lot of time thinking about. This needs to be dismantled. I don't think it... And, the Pentagon now relies on his technology from space, and therefore, what does it do to the nature of global power? The other thing is that if you look at who is going into space, of course, you have states for quite some time now, we've had the space race among states. But now we find that big tech billionaires are the ones who are now going to space for various kinds of things. The idea of the human is changing with this. There are some people who are less than humans, and there are some people who are superhuman. We are creating classes. We always had classes, but we are creating classes now of a kind which we've never seen before. And in addition to that, we have, of course, because the ones who have the maximum money and want to have the maximum traction with people are the ones who are also today, therefore, the philanthropists. And they decide what there will be philanthropy about, how it will be spent. I mean, I think there's a recent book on Bill Gates, which is very fascinating just to study, to understand this. And these are things that are now, we have literature on it. I think we need to spend time to see what this level of inequality, the space race today is the space, invasion of space and taking over of space and doing things in space and ambitions for space. These are things which are talking about inequality on the ground at a level which is very different. And it is creating the idea of the superhuman, which does not have to take responsibility for the human on Earth. I mean, I wouldn't want to stop with this, but I think it is as dramatic as that, and I don't think we should break the drama because it seems...
No, dystopia is useful to know about, and we thought we were in 1984, but we are in a brave new world, which is one way of looking at it. And that's not a very sobering thought, but it's an important recognition, because unless we recognize that, we won't be able to make any progress beyond. Usha, it's always fascinating listening to you, because you open so many windows and take us out of the box and force us to think that in the regular flow of the regular flow and regular road that we go on, we tend to overlook. So thank you once again, and look forward to talking to you again very soon.
Thanks, Salil.
Salil, we've covered a lot of ground here. What would you want businesses to take away from this episode when it comes to advancing human rights in these different places of farm, city, and even space?
Right. I think, when you talk to Usha, you always look at issues from a slightly different angle than what you're used to looking at. And one of the themes that she keeps talking about, quite rightly, is the power equation, because human rights is ultimately about those who have the power and those who do not have power but have rights. The rights holders on one side and the duty bearers on the other side. And she is concerned about the concentration of power in the hands of people who are not accountable. I mean, we expect governments to be accountable, but even governments act in unaccountable ways. But private sector is accountable only to its shareholders and to the law of the land. And I think that's one of the things that comes through very clearly, whether she talks about surveillance, whether she talks about land and its use she wants us to make sure that that concentration of power in the hands of a few people is dangerous. And I think that's an important lesson to bear in mind. And that requires vigilance on the part of the people. That means people have the right to access information. People should have access to the rule of law, to courts of law, and ways to protect and preserve their rights. And that requires regulatory setups, and that requires governments to ensure that those rights are respected. So that vigilance is the second part that becomes important. And therefore, it brings the third element in it, which is the third pillar. If we were to look at, from the framework of John Ruggie and UN guiding principle, which is the state. And the state has the primary obligation to protect rights. It has to continue to protect the rights. And that does mean not only that it has to make sure that there is equal access to justice, but to take affirming steps to make sure that the people, the rights holders, are able to exercise those rights. That does require companies to act under the rule of law and act in a manner that adheres to UN guiding principles and safeguard lives in an extremely holistic manner. What we heard from Usha was, a very wide range of issues. I think it's worth reflecting on some of the points she made about this power imbalance, the fact that people have the rights, and the fact that the state has a duty to protect those rights.
Thank you for the insightful roundup on these important issues. You've been listening to Voices, which is brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights in Business. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast. That way you will never miss an episode. And if you would like to find out more about the work that we do at IHRB, then head to ihrb.org.